you today. I didn't bring my entire library, but I did bring a number of books from that I'll be referring to, and I actually have a slide that most of these are on, just to communicate to you some references that are very helpful in studying not just the topic today, but this entire book. So I want to commend you as a congregation for undertaking this study of If Anyone Would Follow Me. This is like 500 years of Anabaptist history and thought. The Bible forbids us to envy one another, and so I'm going to reclassify my envy into encouragement. I follow this study on YouTube, and I'm not sure, are you getting what excellent teaching that is being presented here from Sunday to Sunday as you work your way through the chapters of this book? And so I encourage you, from the bottom of my heart, I encourage you to make the most of this opportunity to learn from the historians among you about how that our past shapes our present. And we are today because of who those who went before us were. And so that also begs the question, what of those who follow us? And so there is, this is a great study. So I am going to start out with a few look backs. So as I'm looking or watching the YouTube videos from Sunday to Sunday, a few things came to mind. One of them is this. I brought along this Neues Testament and Psalmen, which is the Heilige Schrift. This is the one that I got from my dad when he passed away. And what I would like to point out is that earlier there was I think it was Zach who talked about Martin Luther and his role in the Reformation. And he mentioned just in passing that Martin Luther said that people should be able to understand the Scripture in their native language. And so why continue with Latin? And so he set out to translate the Bible into German. And so are you aware, those of you who over your, in your lifetimes, prior to this, you have heard, you've read the Bible in German and you've heard preaching in German, that this German is according to the Martin Luther Übersetzung, or translation. So the work that Martin Luther did back then is still being used today. In fact, this slide shows this book was published in 2010, which means that relatively recently, the Martin Luther translation is printed in the old German script here in Ohio for use, still use among us. The implications of history are far-reaching. Okay, the second thing I wanted to do is point out to you that for those of you who sing or have sung from the Ausbund, that there has been a great deal of very explicit teaching about martyrdom. And about how I think it was an interesting point that I believe Zach brought out just recently, that when just putting people to death was not effective, torture was added to the process. And so these kind of things make our minds reel, and it's hard for us to enter into the real, what it means to be a martyr. And so I wondered if you were aware that the last martyr in the canton of Bern, where most of our ancestors would have come from, the last martyr was a man named Hans Haslibacher. And so for those of you that were singers, you may remember singing Das Haslibacher Lied. It's it's song number 140. I'm not quite sure what page it is, but this is a long poem that recounts the story of Hans Haslibacher's death. And I'm not going to go in it. It has some other than just to mention, it has some very unique aspects to it. And it's this, that on the night before his execution, he saw in a vision that three things would happen. One is that the sun, is there someone here that can tell me what those three are? One of them is one is that the village fountain would spurt red blood, or like red water, and it actually did, according to the reports. And there's also So his head would fall, he was beheaded, and it would roll into his hat and smile. And if that took place, then he was innocent. And the executioner said, "We have killed an innocent man." And that put an end to the executions in the canton of Bern. But I'm saying this to communicate that this is a long story, and so in the beginning, the birthing of Anabaptism was as we could say, a very hard birth with much bloodshed. But that then passed into a time of, let's say, young adulthood, adolescence and young adult. I think it might be fair to say that when Zach was speaking last Sunday or the Sunday before, whenever it was, about the episode in Munster, that was kind of like the adolescence of Anabaptism. And so when individuals emerge from adolescence, that's the stage in which they kind of learn who they really are. And so we're now moving into the young adulthood of the Anabaptist movement. So if you are reading or following along in the book, by the way, on Hans Haslibacher, there is a farm still today in the Haslibacher name. That is a picture of the barn. Don't know if you can see that very well, but that is, coincidentally, the present-day owner's name is Hans. He changed the spelling of the last name, but his name is Hans Haslibacher, and the family rejoined the Reformed Church, but they are very aware of the story of Hans Haslibacher the martyr, and they actually have a plaque, if you visit there, that commemorates Hans Haslibacher. Okay, so for today, the lesson aim is to recount the journey of Anabaptists from North Germany and Holland east through Poland, on to Russia or Ukraine, and then finally to the Americas. So I just took this right out of the book. The major issues that John Koblenz mentions here are group migration, military exemption, material prosperity, its blessings and its dangers, and appeals to civil government. So because I'm going to assume that those of you who have a deep enough interest, you are reading through the book. There is actually more material in this chapter than could be covered in like the time of a Sunday school period. So of necessity, one must kind of like narrow it down. And so I have chosen 3 breakouts, I'll call them. The first one is a history lesson. And the second one is a faith lesson. The third one is a story lesson. Before we go in there, I wanted to just kind of like remind ourselves that of what we'll call the conservative Anabaptists today. And by conservative Anabaptists, I'm thinking about the groups that we would call that are theologically conservative and non-acculturated. That is, would kind of fit in with the plain people. And so of those groups, the largest branch on the family tree is not us. Our spiritual first cousins, also on the family tree, the Mennonites from North Germany and Holland or the Netherlands or the Low Countries, that group is today much larger than our group is. So they are by far on the family tree. They have the most uncles and aunts and cousins. Okay, and then that's followed by the Swiss Amish Mennonites, of which I would classify us to be part of them, and then the Hutterites. And the Hutterites would be the smallest of these three groups. So we're looking today at the largest branch on the family tree. Okay, so the history lesson. Here's what I want to cover. While our Anabaptist ancestors migrated to America in the late 1600s and early to mid 1700s, so think about late 1600s, early to mid 1700s, that was before the Revolutionary War, which took place like the Declaration of Independence was in 1776. So prior to that, another significant migration took Anabaptists from Holland and Germany through Poland and a place called Prussia. That's not Russia. Prussia was a part of what is present-day Germany. So through Poland and Prussia into Russia, and from there to the Americas, North, Central, and South America. And this happened, this migration to the Americas happened from the late 1800s into the 1900s, up until after World War II. Some arriving, so think about it, like 200 years after our people came from Switzerland, down the Rhine River, and to America. Those who went east and ended up in Russia 200 years later started coming to America. Now, this is an oversimplification. There are, of course, exceptions, but this is like the general trend of the history lesson that we want to cover today. Okay, then the faith lesson is one that I just kind of like, of those issues that John Koblenz mentioned, I picked out non-resistance, because non-resistance was repeatedly tested through this entire, these hundreds of years of history. When the choice was migration or conscription, like into the military, they started packing. This is kind of like the overarching lesson. And then I want to talk about the tragic outcome of Selbstschutz, a German term that means self-defense, at the very end of the Russian Mennonite experience as independent colonies in Russia. And we'll kind of summarize this to think about what it means when following Jesus means moving. And I don't mean just like moving your limbs. I'm talking about packing up and relocating to another country. And then the third is the story lesson is an incident that took place in present-day Ukraine, the Eichenfeld massacre. It concerns a man named Nestor Makhno, who was a revolutionary and the Night of Horrors in a Ukrainian Mennonite village, and kind of finishing up with the Widow's Walk. So those three things we want to cover. So first, the history lesson. So Anabaptist migration was kind of like a seesaw affair. and kind of in this respect. They went from, like were invited by a king to come to Poland. So this map here, so is there I'm sorry, I don't think I need a flasher. I put that arrow in there. So you see there where the Netherlands and Germany are, that's where these people had lived. And then they were invited to come to what is on the map there shown as Danzig, which is what that city was called. Today it's Gdansk in Poland. But to Danzig, and that is a city along the Vistula River. The Vistula River was a very cold river, and it flowed into the Baltic Sea, which is a very cold sea. So they were invited there because they were good farmers, and they knew how to drain land. And so this was a very swampy area, so they were invited to come and drain these swamps and convert it into productive and fertile farmland, which they did. There were many that died from swamp fever and so on during very hot and uncomfortable summers, and then they also survived the very cold and deep snowy winters. So they were living there in Danzig, and they had been promised by the king that they would be exempt from military service. And so after they became wealthy, interestingly, one of their industries was making lace. And so they became like wealthy farmers and became the envy of their neighbors. And so they had like freedom from taxes, freedom exempt from the military. Their neighbors became envious, and so the pressure came to remove those exemptions, and that indeed happened. And when the military exemption ended, they started packing and leaving. The king was very sad to see these good farmers leave, and so he created an exit tax that was very heavy, and to like make them not leave. But they kept on going eastward into Prussia, and so. This story, this teeter-totter, this seesaw, this kingdoms of this world. So part of the big picture is like kingdoms of this world who want people who live in the kingdom of heaven because they are exemplary citizens during times of peace, and they're good for the economy. And then when times of war come, they're no longer welcome. They become persona non gratis. I think we should take a lesson from this. And then the exemptions would be lifted, and they would start to think about packing and moving on. So this happened again in Prussia. And so in 1786, Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, invited Mennonites, as well as other Germans, to come and settle in the Ukraine. So if you look on the map, they're at the bottom end of the red line where the pin is. That's present-day Ukraine. Back then, it was a part of Russia, but it was largely unsettled and kind of overrun by the Cossacks and other Central Asian, like warrior kind of people. And so Catherine, who was actually German and had married a Russian prince, and eventually became the Empress of Russia. And it is said, I want to watch my time here and not go down a bunny trail, but it's kind of an interesting note that most of Europe was ruled by a bunch of second cousins who were all kind of like one extended family. And there was a lot of intermarriage, and it was noted that there were some fairly weak-minded kings, okay? And so the king of Russia married Catherine, and she was a German who had a mind of her own, and she soon ended up being like running the place. And so it was her that invited her fellow Germans to come to Russia, and they gave them some very good terms. 3 things I'll mention: German schools, so they could have their own schools, continue the German language and not learn Russian. They were also free from military service. They had an exemption. And they had to agree to no Russian proselytizing. So they could not proselytize their fellow Russians, though they were allowed to proselytize the Turks and Muslims and others who, like the Cossacks, who were living in the area. Okay, so this led in time to what's called the Golden Age. And this picture comes from Behalt, the cyclorama out here in Berlin, but it kind of shows the Golden Age when each of these farmers who had moved to Ukraine and had received 175 acres of land, which coincidentally they were not allowed to subdivide, they had to unsell, they had to keep that together. They became very prosperous. And they were living in Ukraine where the topsoil is deep, and they learned to grow wheat. And they made this area like the breadbasket of Europe, which it still is today in some respects. Many of them became wealthy and acquired large estates. So it was during this time, in the early 1800s, that prosperity, remember John Koblenz mentioned the danger of prosperity. Prosperity began to kind of cause this spiritual decline. And there was a man named Klaus Reimer who said, we need to do something about this. And he started a renewal movement in the churches that initially was very small, so it's called the Kleine Gemeinde, just the small church. And the Kleine Gemeinde still exists today in the New World, in Belize and in other places. And some of you might actually know some Kleine Gemeinde people. So about this, soon thereafter, they lost their privileges in 1874. Many of the Mennonites left and moved to Canada and to Kansas. Some of them left, but not all of them. So in 1914 through 1918, World War I started. This was the beginning of the end for the Mennonites that were still living in Ukraine. That's Lenin, and communism is just starting. So it started with the Bolshevik Revolution. More could be said about that, but Mennonite survivors who stayed lost all their property, and or they disappeared into the Soviet Gulag, that network of prisons and labor camps in what's often just called, they were sent to Siberia. Interestingly, when World War II came, there were still some Mennonites living there in their villages, in their ancestral homes, though their lands had all been collectivized and were now part of large collective farms. But they were still living there, and when the Nazi Germans moved eastward into Russia to attack Moscow, the Mennonites generally welcomed the Nazis as liberators, deliverers, fellow German-speaking people. Delivered them from the harsh hand of communism. And so this was all well and good for them until the tide of the war turned. And when the tide turned and the Nazis began retreating back toward Berlin, this was a terrible time for the Mennonite settlers, the Mennonite colonists. They had to decide, what will we do? And most of them just followed along the tail of the army and went back into Germany, leaving their houses, everything, all their possessions except what they could carry. They left there. And they worked their way back into Berlin. And so I'm going to mention right here, does anyone know about this book, Henry's Red Sea? Henry's Red Sea, I want to put a shout out for this book. I think you can buy it at the Mennonite Information Center. No, Carita? Okay, so, well, you can buy it on Amazon, because I just checked. Okay, the cover's different, but it's a children's book, and it's the story about this family that ends up in Berlin at the end of the war, and they are trying to escape, and they eventually make it onto a train through the Soviet sector to the port of Amsterdam or Antwerp, I forget which, where they get onto a ship, I think the Volendam, and make it to Paraguay? I think so. And that's the Red Sea that Henry went through, like where God provided a way out of. If you want to teach your children about our heritage, this is a great book to read. Okay, so let's go to the faith lesson. Non-resistance tested. So here's a theme that I want for us to think about. When following Jesus means moving. From time, again and again, their non-resistance would be tested. And the war's hard choices. Now, I'm talking here now about going back to World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution. So in World War I, Germany attacked Russia, and eventually that war ended. But Russia was in a turmoil, and the Bolsheviks, who were the communists, those that inaugurated communism, it was Lenin, and then, of course, later Stalin, but he was not a leader then. But they basically declared war. Civil war broke out, and basically law and order ended. And it was like the Wild West by a power of 10. It was like really bad, really dangerous to be living, especially if you had property. If you were a landowner, the Bolsheviks said, that's bad. You see, they've taken advantage of you all these years, and now it's time for you to get what you deserve. And that led to just like burning, pillaging, destruction throughout Ukraine. And it was during this time that there were some of the younger men who said, who found themselves caught in this question of conscience. What is most important? Maintaining our non-resistant love of enemies, or when your enemies are coming to kill you and to rape and pillage in your village, to defend those whom you love. And that led into the formation of what is called Selbstschutz, or self-defense units. You can't kind of make that out, but that's what that picture is across the bottom. And so there's some tragic outcomes of this. So for starters, Mennonites are not good fighters, okay? And so they were like no match. And we'll talk more about this now in the story, the Eichenfeld massacre. So there was a small village in southern Ukraine. Today, that village is Novopetrivka. I have actually been there, I think 3 times. By the way, my wife and I and our family, and Zach, when he was a boy, we lived in Kiev, Ukraine for a winter. And during that time, and I have other family members that lived there for many more years than we did. And so and we have Ukrainian people married into our family, and so we had opportunity to travel back and forth a number of times. The last time with a tour group that was visiting the 7 churches in Asia, and as part of that trip, we also went to Ukraine and visited the Russian Mennonite area. And so we've been to this village. So this man, Nestor Makhno, was a one-time farm worker on large Mennonite estates. And it is alleged that he was very bitter toward the Mennonites because of what he understood to be like them taking advantage of their Ukrainian neighbors because they were the wealthy landowners. And so once but he was a born leader. And once the Bolshevik Revolution broke out, he was not initially actually a Bolshevik or a communist. He was mainly just a flat-out bandit, a bloody, brutal bandit that had a band of people, a band of men, and they just went marauding through the countryside and just pillaging and raping and taking property. And so they came into this town called Eichenfeld. That is a picture of Nestor Mako. He was not present that evening, but it was under his orders that this night of horrors took place where they arrived in the village. There were about 200 plus people living in this village, and it was not like we think in terms of farmers, where every farmer lives out on his land. They would have their land out where the land was, and then they all lived together along streets in a colony, and like the landowners lived on one street, the landless lived on other streets. And so they came down the street of the landowners and they would ask, do you own land? And if the answer was yes, they would be summarily executed on the spot. And women and children were running and hiding, and some of them were hacked to death. But when the night was over, 72 people had been murdered. 3 of them women, but the rest of the wives and the girls were spared, often to suffer a worse fate. In the following days, burial parties came from neighboring villages, and they were robbed and killed as well. So ultimately, there were 136 deaths there related to the Eichenfeld massacre, and eventually they were all buried in unmarked graves. Okay, so the widow's walk refers to the next morning when it was safe to go outside because the bandits had left. 45 widows with their more than 200 children started the trek to a neighboring village. Today yet, from time to time, there is a widow's walk where the posterity and the relatives of those who suffered, their posterity come, and in memorial, they make this walk from the village of Eichenfeld to the neighboring village. There is today now, and this is a very poor picture. I took this picture and wasn't paying very good attention, but that's actually a plaque there where you see the shadows of men or people over it. That's a plaque that was erected in, I think, around 1905 or 2005 maybe. To commemorate, and it has 136 names on it, the names of the 136 who died there, whose graves had never been marked. So there are Mennonites from Canada. They are like Enns and Penners and Lowens and so on that show up there, and from time to time have like a memorial service. Okay, so our guide was a man named Victor Penner, and I'll spend the rest of the time kind of talking about Victor Penner. So I have this little book, Nestor Makhno and the Eichenfeld Massacre, which gives this story. Most of the details are coming from this book. I took this along on our last trip to Eichenfeld, and our guide, Victor Penner, wrote in the front there to Paul Miller, from Mennonite victim's descendant, Victor Penner of Zaporozhye. Zaporozhye is the present location, the large city in that area. We pray that the tragedy will never happen again. That was on October 15, 2010. So this is one of the books that I have in my collection that I get down from time to time and just hold in my hands. So, okay, so what actually happened to the Russian Mennonites who did not migrate to America? Most of them made their way eventually to America. They went to Canada, to the Great Plains in the Midwest, and then when Canada took away their military exemptions and said, you have to start learning to speak English, they said, uh-oh, we've heard that before, and they packed up and moved to Mexico. And that's where many of the large, and on south into Central America and South America. And today there are colonies there with I think Brother Dean Taylor visited one colony, and when he asked how many are living here, the answer was, it was 50,000. So the numbers are just huge. By the way, I am, as I thought about this, I wish that there were a Russian Mennonite among us that could have presented this, because I can only present it from the perspective of that we see. So are there any Russian Mennonites in the room here? No? Okay, I only actually know of one and maybe a second one. There is in Martinsburg, Ohio, just recently at an ordination, there was a Peter Dick who was in the lot for ordination, and I learned that he actually is a Russian Mennonite. So there is a Beachy Amish Russian Mennonite, if you can get your mind around that. And I wasn't quite sure, is Stephen, your brother-in-law Kevin Cron, is he Russian Mennonite? Okay. Okay, but they're all this to say they're rare among us. Okay, so what happened to those who did not migrate to the Americas? Okay, so after Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost, or openness, in the 1980s, Germans began to emerge from Siberia and from the stans, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on, to which they had been banished. But none of the Mennonites were intact in the sense that they re-emerged as Mennonites. From our perspective, and we interacted with them, some of them, when we lived in Kiev in 2005, they were close enough to us theologically and doctrinally that we kind of edged up to each other and said, we kind of know each other, don't we? And but they were all non-registered or unregistered Baptists. So I think it's, as a general rule, the Mennonites who were sent into the Gulag did not survive as Mennonites, except for a few of them that are still remaining way out in Tajikistan, and in Central Asia, there are a few dwindling congregations. But the rest of them were all kind of brought into the unregistered Baptist church. There are some very interesting stories. There was one group that walked from across Central Asia into China, eventually ended up in New Zealand, and from New Zealand made it to the Americas. So there are more than one way to get here. So when you go to these villages, like when you go to the village that was Eichenfeld and others like that, it's interesting that the houses, you know immediately which are the Mennonite houses, because the Mennonite houses are generally made of brick. The gable of the house faces the street. And I have a picture of one. Actually, I neglected to point it out, but it was brand new in 1913. On the gable end, there's an wrought iron 1913, which was the year before World War I started, and it all unraveled. And I wonder, it's this picture of a family that poured their money and their efforts into a new house, and in a year it all came apart. But they had the houses had kind of steep roofs, and the reason that stands out is that they had learned that when they lived in Poland and in Prussia, where it could snow like 3 feet in no time. And so they built very steep roofs so the snow would slide off of the roofs. When they went to Ukraine, they continued that same methodology. Another thing they did, so just recently, Nathan, we interact at our church in Canton. Excuse me, Nathan and Vicki Yoder attend. And Nathan would just this on Friday night we were together, and we were talking about this. Then he said, yes, he grew up in Costa Rica. He said, we had some kleine Gemeinde people come to our Beachy Amish church and became members there. They moved into the community, and they did what the Bible says. They built their barns before they built their houses. Okay? Proverbs 25, verse 23. Look it up. But what they did generally is they would build a building like a house barn or a barn house with a well in the middle, livestock at one end, people lived at the other end. In Ukraine, when you saw that, Victor Penner said, immediately, that was a Mennonite. And so that was isn't that interesting that what was happening in Holland and in Poland and in Prussia and in Russia eventually works its way to Costa Rica hundreds of years later, and they do it the same way. So what I want to end up with is this. Victor Penner was a Ukrainian that served as our tour guide. He was a Mennonite, and I had opportunity to interact with him a number of times. I asked him, are you Mennonite? And he said to me, to you, being Mennonite is a faith. To me, it's a culture. So, I'm saying this to ask ourselves a rhetorical question. What is being a Mennonite to you? Okay, I'll turn the time back to Jason.